In the spring of 1884, in the town of Bell Forks, Montana Territory, the Ladies' Aid Society held a charity box social to raise money for a new church roof. And the rule of the thing was simple. A woman packed a supper in a decorated box, the boxes were auctioned to the bachelors, and the man who paid the most ate his supper with the woman who had made it. The proceeds went to the roof. The whole town treated it as a kind of harmless theater, a way to put a price on an afternoon. And most years the bidding ran lively and loud. But that year there was a box at the end of the table that no one would touch. It was a plain box wrapped in flour sack cloth, tied with a strip of unbleached muslin, and the woman who had made it stood at the back of the hall with her hands folded and her chin level, and her name was Ada Vance, and she sewed for a living. The auctioneer called for a bid. He called twice. He called a third time, and the silence sat in that hall like a stone in a creek. What the men of Bell Forks did not yet know, and what Ada herself could not have guessed, was that the silence would break from the one corner of the room nobody was watching, and that before the next winter was out, the price of that supper would turn out to be the cheapest thing the wealthiest man in the county ever bought. Stay with me, and you will see how a box no one wanted became the start of the most talked-of marriage in the valley. Ada had come to Bell Forks 2 years earlier on a freight wagon out of Cheyenne, with a sewing machine roped under a tarp and $40 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, where no road agent and no hard winter could find it without finding her first. She had been a tailor's daughter in Ohio, in a river town whose name she did not much like to say, and she had learned the trade at a table beside her father from the age of 6, basting and then seaming and then cutting, until his eyes failed over the fine work, and then 2 years after that, his heart failed too, in the night, in his chair, with a half-finished coat across his knees. After that there had been a man she was meant to marry, a man who had courted her through one whole summer and then, in the fall, married a girl with 80 acres and a milk herd instead, and had explained to Ada, kindly, that a man had to think of his future. She did not speak of him. She had taken the lesson instead and packed it with the sewing machine. She rented 2 rooms above the harness shop, the smell of leather and neat's foot oil coming up through the floor, and she hung out a shingle that read alterations and mending in letters she had painted herself. And she made the women of Bell Forks dresses that fit them better than anything the catalog could ship from Chicago. And she charged fairly and finished on time and never gossiped about what she saw of their figures or their household economies. For this, they were grateful and kept their distance both at once. A woman who worked with her hands for money, who had no husband and no people and no parlor and no past she would discuss, was a useful thing in a frontier town and an uneasy one. They brought her their torn hems and their wedding gowns and their burial clothes, the whole span of a life in cloth, and they did not invite her to supper, and at Christmas they paid their bills and wished her well and went home to their families. Ada understood the arrangement without anyone explaining it. She had understood arrangements her whole life, and she asked nothing of Bell Forks but honest pay for honest work, and got it, and told herself that was enough, and nearly believed it. The wealthiest man in that part of the territory was named Reed Calloway, and he owned the Long Nine, a cattle outfit that ran better than 4,000 head across the benchland north of the river, and employed 11 men through the working season. He was a widower of some 6 years. His wife had died of a fever the second winter on the place, and he had buried her on the hill above the ranch house and had not spoken her name in company since. He was a tall, spare, weathered man in his early 40s, slow to talk and slower to laugh, and the valley had decided long ago that he was proud. He was not proud. He was lonely in a way he had no language for, and he had learned that the safest thing to do with a feeling that big was to keep it inside a fence where the wind could not get at it. He came to the box social because the church roof needed mending, and because his foreman's wife had told him plainly that a man of his means could not be seen to skip it. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands, intending to bid high on something early and leave. He had not meant to wait for the last box, But he watched the auctioneer call for a bid on the plain flour sack parcel, and he watched the silence answer, and he watched the woman at the back of the hall hold her chin a little higher against it, and something in him that had been frozen for 6 years cracked a half-inch. He knew her. Not to speak to. She had taken in a coat of his the previous fall, turned the collar and set new buttons, and had charged him exactly what the work was worth and not a cent more, and had handed it back folded so the mend did not show. He had thought at the time that here was a person who did not waste a thing, not cloth, not time, not words. Now he watched the room decide her supper was worth nothing, and he heard himself say, into the third silence, loud enough to carry, $4. The hall turned as one to look at him. The auctioneer, recovering, asked, did he hear $4? And Reed said no, he had misspoken, and the room exhaled, and then Reed said the figure he had actually meant. $40. It was more than any box had ever fetched in the history of the Bell Forks box social, more than some of those men cleared in a month, and the auctioneer brought the gavel down before Reed could think better of it, and Ada Vance at the back of the hall did not smile and did not blush. She picked up her box and carried it to the table where the buyer sat, and she set it down in front of him, and she said, that is a great deal of money for cold chicken and a biscuit. And Reed Calloway, who had not made a joke in 6 years, said it had better be very good chicken then. It was the first thing either of them said to the other, and neither of them knew it was the first sentence of the rest of their lives. The supper itself was a quiet, awkward, watched affair, conducted at a corner table near the cold stove while the rest of the hall pretended not to stare, and the auctioneer moved the leftover sociability along with a fiddler and a plate of fundraising pie. Ada untied the strip of muslin and folded back the flour sack cloth, and what came out of that plain box shamed every gingham and ribbon parcel that had fetched $2 before it. There was cold, fried chicken, jointed clean, and biscuits split and buttered, and a small crock of choke cherry jelly she had put up herself the autumn before, and 2 tin cups, and a corked bottle of cold coffee, and a cloth napkin hemmed so fine the stitches did not show. The chicken was very good. The biscuit was better. Reed Calloway, who took his meals standing up half the year and cold the other half, ate slowly, and noticed that there were 2 of everything, 2 cups, 2 biscuits split, 2 portions laid out with care, and he understood without being told what that meant. Ada had packed for company. She had stood in her 2 rooms above the harness shop that morning and packed a supper for 2, against all the evidence of 2 years in Bell Forks, on the chance that someone would buy the box and sit with her, and that small ruinous hope, laid bare in a tin cup, moved him more than anything she could have said. They did not say much. He asked how she found the territory, and she said cold and honest, in that order, and the way she set the 2 words side by side, the weather and the people both, told him she had taken the measure of the place exactly. She asked what a man did with 4,000 head of cattle, and he said mostly worry, and she said that sounded like every trade she knew, and they ate the rest of the supper in a silence that was, for the first time in either of their lives, comfortable. When the social ended and the women began packing the leftover pie and the men drifted toward the door and their horses, Ada thanked him for the roof, by which she plainly meant the church and not herself, and she gathered her empty box and her flour sack cloth and her 2 tin cups and walked home up the muddy street in the last gray light, her back straight, not hurrying. Reed sat at the corner table a while longer with the strange sensation of a man who has paid $40 and come away certain he got the better of the bargain, and he turned the empty napkin over in his hands and found the hem and could not, for the life of him, feel where the stitches were. What followed was not a courtship as the Valley understood courtship. There were no buggy rides on Sundays, no flowers, no calling cards left in a dish. There was, instead, work. A week after the social, a bolt of broadcloth arrived at Ada's door. good wool the color of slate, more than she had ordered and more than any one job could use, with a note in a square, plain hand, asking her to make of it whatever the ranch house needed, and to bill the long nine for the labor. She turned the bolt over once on her cutting table and understood the note for what it was, which was a man asking to be allowed near her without having to say so. She made curtains for the windows that had gone bare since the first Mrs. Calloway died, 6 windows, lined and hemmed, and she made them well, and she billed exactly the labor and folded the unused yardage and sent it back with the wagon. Reed unrolled the returned cloth in the empty front room of his house and stood a long while looking at the curtains hung against his cold glass, and the next Saturday he found a reason to ride the 8 miles into town. A torn saddle blanket that wanted binding. The Saturday after that, a canvas duster split at the seam. The Saturday after that, a pair of work gloves whose stitching he could perfectly well have left alone. Each errand was real, and each was a pretext, and they both knew it, and neither said so. And he would sit on the bench outside her door with his hat on his knee while she worked at the window above, and he would tell her about the bench land and the river that ran low in August and the 11 men and the price of beef in Chicago, and she would mend and listen, and now and then say a thing so dry and exact that he carried it the 8 miles home and turned it over for a week. She told him once, biting a thread, that a seam was just 2 torn things agreeing to hold. He thought about that all the way to the river crossing and most of the night after. He began to leave things. A sack of good coffee on her step before she was up. A cord of split stove wood stacked against her wall one frozen morning with no note and no name, though there was only one man in the county who would haul firewood 8 miles and not say so. Ada said nothing of the wood. She burned it through the cold snap and stacked the next load he brought without comment, and that wordless exchange, the giving and the accepting and the not mentioning, was the truest conversation either of them had yet managed. She had not told him the whole truth of herself, and he had not asked, and that suited them both for a season. But the Valley had decided things about Ada Vance, and the Valley did not like to be contradicted by the wealthiest man in it. The women who brought her their mending began to bring it with a coolness, and a few took their work to a woman in Miles City instead. And the talk in the mercantile turned to what a clever creature the little seamstress was, to have caught Reed Calloway's eye with a $40 box, as if Ada had engineered the whole thing, as if she had stood up in that hall and shamed a lonely man into a bid. Reed heard the talk, and it made his jaw set hard, but Ada heard it too. And to Ada, it was an old song in a new town, and she answered it the only way she knew, which was to do excellent work and charge fairly and keep her chin level. She did not defend herself. She had learned long ago that defending yourself to people who have decided about you only gives them more to talk about. She let the work answer, and the work, slowly, did. The thing that began to turn the Valley was a child. Reed had no children of his own, but his foreman, a steady Norwegian named Jonas Holt, had a daughter of about 9 named Greta, a solemn, watchful girl with pale braids who had lost her mother to the same kind of fever that took Mrs. Calloway, and who had taken to riding into town behind her father and sitting on Ada's step while the men talked cattle below. The first time Greta watched Ada work through the window for the better part of an hour, saying nothing, and Ada, who knew the particular silence of a motherless child because she had once kept it herself, finally opened the door and handed the girl a needle and a square of scrap muslin and a button, and showed her how to anchor the thread without a knot showing. It started with that button. It grew into a sampler, crooked at first and then less so, and it grew from there into a friendship that the child wore openly and without shame, the way children do, walking the muddy street hand in hand with the seamstress, carrying the basket of thread between them, swinging it. The women of Bell Forks saw little Greta Holt's pale braids beside Ada's dark head, bent over the same hem, and something in the story they had been telling themselves, The clever creature who had shamed a $40 bid out of a lonely man began to come apart at the seam. Then Greta told her father, and her father told the men at the branding fire, and the men told their wives over supper, that Ada Vance was teaching the Holt girl her letters along with her stitches, free of charge, in the hours after the mending was done, that the girl who had not spoken much since her mother died now read aloud from a primer at Ada's window every Saturday and was getting on. It was a small fact. It did a great deal of work. The frontier forgave many things in a person who was good to its children, and it had a long memory for those who were not, and the valley began, slowly and without admitting it, to revise. By the time the aspens turned, Reed Calloway had stopped pretending his errands were errands. He came on Saturdays and stayed past dark, and one evening in October, sitting on the bench with the first cold coming down off the mountains, he said the thing he had ridden 8 miles to say a dozen times and swallowed. He said he was a plain man with more land than company, and that he had buried one wife and had not expected to want another and had been wrong about it, and that he would consider himself fortunate beyond his deserving if Ada Vance would think on marrying him. He did not say love. He did not have the word handy, and he did not trust it. But Ada, who had been listening for the truth under the words for 2 years, heard it plainly, and she set down her sewing, and she said she would think on it, and she thought on it for exactly the length of time it took her to thread the next needle, and then she said yes. They did not touch. They did not need to. The cold came down off the mountains, and the lamp burned in the window, and 2 guarded people sat on a bench and agreed, without saying so, to hold. She told him the rest of it then, because a thing built on a half-truth would not hold, and Ada built things to hold. She told him about the man in Ohio who had married land instead of her, and about how she had decided after that she would never again wait at the back of any hall for someone to choose her, and how the box social had been a kind of test she had set the whole town without meaning to, and how she had packed 2 of everything out of a hope she was ashamed of. And Reed listened, and when she was done, he told her the thing he had not told anyone, which was that he had stopped saying his first wife's name not out of grief, but out of guilt, because he had been in the far pasture when the fever took her and had not been there at the end, and had carried that 8 miles of absence inside him for 6 years. They traded their wounds across the small table the way other couples trade gifts, and neither flinched from what the other set down, and that, more than the $40, more than the broadcloth, more than the bench, was the moment the marriage truly began. The valley, had it been watching, would have seen nothing at all. Just a lamp, and 2 heads bent together, and the long Montana night. They were married in November by a circuit preacher named Eckhart, who rode through Bell Forks once a quarter and married and buried whoever had accumulated since his last passage, in a small ceremony in the church whose roof Ada's box had helped to mend, witnessed by Jonas Holt and his daughter Greta, who carried the ring on a small pillow she had stitched herself under Ada's eye, and was so proud of the work she could hardly hold it level, and by a scattering of townsfolk who came partly out of friendship and partly to be able to say afterward that they had been there. Ada wore a dress of gray wool she had cut and sewn herself across 3 evenings, beautifully made, close through the bodice, without a scrap of ornament, because she had dressed other women for their weddings her whole life and knew exactly what she wanted and exactly what she did not. Reed wore the coat she had turned the collar on the autumn before, the same coat that had first brought him to her door, and only Ada knew it, and the knowing was its own small ceremony underneath the public one. There was no feast and no dancing and no fiddle. There was cake and coffee, and the particular held quiet of 2 people who had each privately given up on this exact happiness and found it anyway, late after they had stopped looking, and were almost afraid to be seen enjoying it in case the seeing broke it. When the preacher asked Reed if he took this woman to wife, Reed said he did plainly, and then, Because $40 in 2 years had taught him the worth of saying a little more than was strictly required, he added that he had been trying to buy this woman supper for 2 years and had finally managed it. The church laughed, the whole small room of it, and even the women who had carried their mending to Miles City laughed, and Greta Holt laughed loudest of all and nearly dropped the empty pillow. It was, in its small and unremarkable way, the precise moment the valley came around, and Ada, standing in her gray wool with her hand in Reed Calloway's, heard the laughter for what it was and let it stand in for the apology the town would never quite manage to say out loud. Ada moved her sewing machine and her 2 trunks out to the long 9 in the back of the same wagon that had once hauled the broadcloth, and she made the ranch house into a home the way she made everything, by attending to the seams. The house had been a widower's house for 6 years, clean enough and cold throughout, with good furniture nobody sat in, and a parlor nobody entered. And Ada went through it room by room the way she went through a coat that wanted altering, deciding what to keep and what to take in, and what had simply been let go too long. She made curtains for every window and quilts for every bed, and she made a Sunday dress for Greta Holt, who was at the house so often that winter that she half lived there and kept a pair of stockings drying by the Calloway stove. Ada set a chair by the south window where the light came in good and clear, and she worked there through the short afternoons with her father's box of needles open beside her. And Reed got into the habit of coming in from the cold and the cattle and standing in the doorway in his stocking feet just to look at her there in the lamplight. The dark head bent, the hands moving, a thing he never tired of and never explained to anyone, least of all to her. He learned the rhythm of her work the way he had learned the rhythm of the seasons. He learned that she hummed without knowing it when a piece was going well and went silent when it fought her, and that the silence was not to be interrupted. She learned that he talked most at the end of a hard day, and least at the end of an easy one, and that a plate kept warm on the back of the stove said more to him than any question. They built, that first married winter, a life so quiet and so full that it would have made dull telling, a life of stove wood and mending and the price of beef and a child reading at the window. And that was exactly the point of it, and exactly the thing each of them had stopped believing they would have. But the frontier does not let a quiet life stay quiet for long, and the test that every life out there must pass came for the Callaways in their 2nd February, when the worst storm in the valley's memory came down out of the north, and the bond they had built without words was made to prove itself in a single night. It began at noon with a sky the color of a bruise, and a wind that came on so fast the men were caught strung out across the benchland moving cattle to the lower draws. Reed was 4 miles from the house with Jonas Holt and 2 others when the snow hit. A wall of it, horizontal, the temperature falling past anything the thermometer on the porch could hold, settling that night near 40 below. They got the main herd to shelter and turned for home in the white dark, and somewhere in the last 2 miles Jonas Holt's horse went down in a drift and rolled, and Jonas came up with a leg that would not bear him, and the cold began at once to do its patient, terrible work on a man who could not move. Reed got him up across his own saddle and brought him the last mile by feel because there was nothing to see but snow, and he came into the yard half frozen himself, shouting, and Ada had the door open and the lamps lit and the stove roaring before the words reached her, because she had been watching the storm since noon and had readied the house the way she readied everything in advance against the worst. What happened in that house through that night was the hardest work Ada Vance ever did, and she did it with her sleeves pushed up and her chin level and no one to help her but a 9-year-old girl. Jonas Holt was past speech, his leg broken below the knee, his hands and feet white and waxen with the cold, his breath shallow. The doctor was 11 miles off in town, and the town was on the far side of the storm, and no rider could cross it and live. So Ada did what there was to do. She had the men strip the frozen clothes from Jonas, and she wrapped him in heated blankets, changing them as they cooled, working through the night so the warmth came back into him slow and not fast, because she had read in one of her father's books, years before, that a frozen man warmed too quickly will die of it, and she had never forgotten a thing she read. She set his leg with a splint made of 2 sticks of kindling and strips torn from her own best petticoat, pulling the bone straight while Reed held the man's shoulders and Greta held the lamp, and did not look away, though her face was the color of the snow outside. She kept the stove fed and the blankets turning and the broth warm and spooned into him a swallow at a time. She did not stop. She lost track of the hours. She lost the feeling in her own feet from the floor and the feeling in her own hands from the wringing of hot cloths, and she kept working, because the alternative was a child without a father, and Ada had been a child without a father, and she would not allow it if her 2 ruined hands could prevent it. Near dawn the wind dropped, and Jonas Holt opened his eyes, and the color was coming back into his hands, ugly and blistered, but living, and his pulse under Ada's fingers had steadied into something she could trust. She sat back on the floor beside the cot then, for the first time in 12 hours, and found she could not stand. Reed knelt beside her and took her hands, which were cracked and bleeding from the hot cloths and the cold floor. And he did not say a speech because he was not a man for speeches, and because there was no speech equal to it. He warmed her hands between his own, breath by breath, the way she had warmed Jonas, and she let him. And across the room Greta Holt looked from her sleeping father to the 2 of them on the floor, and said the thing that no adult in that house could have said, which was that she guessed Ada was the strongest person in the whole valley, and that she was glad Mr. Calloway had bought her supper. Ada laughed, a cracked and exhausted sound, and Reed did not laugh because his throat had closed, and he sat on the floor of his own ranch house, holding the broken, bleeding hands of his wife, and understood that he had, 2 years before, into a hall full of silence, bid the truest $40 of his life. Jonas Holt walked again by summer, with a limp he carried to the end of his days and never once complained of. And he told the story of that night in every bunkhouse and bar-room and branding fire from Bell Forks to Miles City, and he told it the same way every time, leaving nothing out and adding nothing, which was that the wealthiest man in the county had married the only person on the whole bench land worth 4,000 head of cattle, and that anyone who had stood in that hall 2 years before and let her box go unbid through 3 callings of the gavel ought to be ashamed to the end of his natural life. The valley, hearing it told so by a man it trusted, a man who would have died but for those 2 ruined hands, was ashamed in the small way valleys are, all at once and without quite saying so. And then it did the thing valleys do, which was to fold the Calloways into its own story, as though it had always known how the thing would turn out, as though there had never been a silence in that hall at all. The women who had taken their mending to the woman in Miles City brought it back, with apologies dressed up as compliments, and Ada took the work and charged fairly and said nothing of the gap, because a person who keeps a ledger of slights has no room in her hands for thread. The Ladies' Aid Society the following spring came to Ada and asked her to organize the box social, the very social that had once let her stand unbid at the back, and Ada considered the request for the length of time it took to thread a needle, and then she agreed on 2 conditions. The first was that no box go for less than $2, so that no woman's supper would ever again be valued at nothing in front of the town. The second was that the boxes be bid on blind, the maker unknown to the bidder until after the gavel fell, so that no woman would ever again stand at the back of any hall and watch the room decide her worth to her face. They printed the new rules in the church bulletin, and they held for 30 years, and more than one marriage in that valley began under them. Ada never said "I told you so." She did not need to. The rule said it for her every spring, to every girl in the valley who might otherwise have learned what Ada had learned in a river town in Ohio, that you wait at the back and you take what you are offered and you are grateful for it. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, born across the next 8 years in the ranch house Ada had seamed into a home. The eldest boy, named for no one in particular because Ada did not believe in laying a dead person's name across a living child like a hand-me-down coat, grew up tall and quiet like his father, and ran the long nine well into the new century, through droughts and beef panics and the coming of the barbed wire and the railroad spur. The younger boy went east to study medicine. Sent there, his mother always said, by a February night in a book of her father's that had told her how to warm a frozen man slow. And he came back at last to be the doctor in the very town that had once been 11 miles too far to reach through a storm, and set bones for 40 years in the country his mother had splinted a leg in with kindling and a torn petticoat. The girl, the youngest, learned to sew at her mother's chair by the south window, and learned her letters there too, the way Greta Holt had before her. And there was always, in that house, for as long as the eyes and hands of its mistress would allow, some child of the valley sitting at Ada's knee with a needle and a primer, because she never once turned a child away, free of charge, in the hours after the day's work was done, having decided long before that a thing she had needed and not been given, she would give to everyone she could reach. Greta Holt, herself, the foreman's daughter who had held the lamp steady through the worst night of her young life, married the elder Calloway boy in the fullness of time, so that the child who had carried the wedding ring on a pillow she stitched became the mistress of the long nine, and the two families that had held together through one hard night were bound together for good, and the limp Jonas Holt carried walked his own grandchildren to school. Reed Calloway died in the autumn of 1911 in his bed, with his wife's cracked and capable hand in his, and Ada had him buried on the hill above the ranch house, beside the first Mrs. Calloway, whose name Ada had insisted on speaking aloud and often because a thing built on a buried truth would not hold, and Ada built things to hold. She lived 11 more years, and she sewed nearly to the end. And when her own eyes failed at last the way her father's had, the women of the valley came in turns to read to her and to bring their daughters to sit at her knee, and she told them, when they asked, the same thing every time. She told them that the best things in a hard life are the ones you stop waiting for. When she died in the spring of 1922, they buried her on the hill beside Reed, above the bench land and the river and the 4,000 head, with the whole valley turned out in the road below, and the marker they set, by her own instruction, carried no grand words, only the two names and the years, and, beneath, a single line that the stonecutter had thought strange and the valley understood completely. It read, "She did not wait." Up at the house, in the window where the light was good, her sewing chair stood empty, and on the small table beside it, where she had left it, was a plain box wrapped in flour sack cloth, tied with a strip of unbleached muslin that she had kept for 38 years and never once explained, and did not need to. Did you ever stand at the back of a hall and wait to be chosen and wish someone had taught you sooner that you could simply stop waiting? Tell me in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, stay a while longer, for there is another like it waiting just here.